The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a golden haze across the cotton fields. The rows of white seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the figures bent under their weight, hands moving in a steady rhythm. Among them was Robert, a boy of no more than 10 years, his small hands already calloused from the daily grind. His bare feet shuffled through the dirt as he worked, his mind wandering far from the rows he tended. The voices around him formed a symphony of murmurs, groans, and the occasional hum of a work song. The older slaves sang to keep the rhythm of their labor, their voices deep and sorrowful, resonating with the weight of lives lived in chains. Robert didn't join in. Instead, he listened. He always listened. It was during one of these mornings that Robert first heard the words that would change his life. The overseer had allowed the plantation owner's son to read aloud as a form of amusement. Sitting under the shade of a nearby tree, the boy's voice carried over the fields as he read a poem from a book. The words flowed like water, smooth and rhythmic, painting images in Robert's mind that no sight had ever conjured before. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," the boy read, his voice clear and deliberate. Robert froze mid-motion, the words lodging themselves in his mind. He didn't understand all the meanings, but the sound of them, the rise and fall, the melody of language, it struck something deep within him. "Keep moving, boy!" the overseer barked, snapping Robert back to reality. He hurriedly returned to his work, but the words lingered, circling in his head. By the end of the day, he had memorized them, repeating them silently to himself as he picked, as he walked, and even as he lay in the cramped quarters he shared with his family. That night, as the fire flickered low and the others drifted into restless sleep, Robert sat awake. Quietly, he whispered the words to himself, savoring their sound. Then, without fully realizing it, he added his own. "A joy forever though we are bound. Our spirits rise where hope is found." The firelight danced in his eyes as he repeated the lines, smiling softly to himself. For the first time, Robert felt something stir within him, a spark of something he couldn't name but knew he would never let go. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the huddled figures in the slave quarters. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and wood smoke, but Robert barely noticed. He sat apart from the others, his hands idly tracing patterns in the dirt, as he recited the poem he had memorized earlier. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," he whispered, then paused, letting the words settle before continuing. Though he couldn't read, Robert had a gift for holding words in his mind, turning them over like polished stones. He remembered not just the lines but the cadence, the emotion behind them. His voice was soft, almost reverent, as he began to weave his own words into the rhythm. "In chains we toil, the sun our foe. But beauty lives where shadows grow." A faint rustle made him glance up. An older woman, Aunt Lila, watched him from her corner of the room, her eyes sharp despite the lines etched deep in her face. "Boy, what you muttering over there?" she asked, her tone curious but wary. Robert hesitated, unsure if he should share. Words were precious, and he guarded them closely. But something in Aunt Lila's gaze encouraged him. "Just poems," he said finally. "I hear 'em, then I make 'em my own." Aunt Lila's expression softened, a flicker of something, pride, crossing her face. She leaned closer, her voice low. "Be careful, Robert. Words like that, they ain't just words. They're power. And power can be dangerous round here." Robert nodded, understanding the weight of her warning, but he couldn't stop. Each word he composed felt like a small act of freedom, a piece of himself that could never be taken away. The sun hung high in the sky, merciless in its heat. Robert worked quietly, the familiar ache in his back a dull constant. He moved mechanically, his thoughts far away, building a new poem in his mind. "Dreams of freedom in fields of white. Chains can't bind the soul's true light." His quiet concentration was interrupted by a commotion near the barn. A young man named Samuel, barely older than Robert, was dragged out by two overseers. In Samuel's hand was a tattered book, its cover faded and worn. "Think you can teach yourself to read, huh?" one of the overseers sneered. "You don't need words. You need to learn your place." Robert froze, his heart pounding as he watched Samuel struggle. The book was snatched away, tossed to the ground, and trampled under the overseer's boot. Then came the crack of a whip, its sharp sound splitting the air. The other slaves worked harder, heads down, avoiding the scene. But Robert couldn't look away. The sight of Samuel's defiance, and the price he paid for it, burned into his memory. That night, as the pain and exhaustion of the day clung to him, Robert lay awake, staring at the wooden beams overhead. He repeated Samuel's name in his mind, letting it mingle with the poems he created. Samuel stood where courage grew. His voice was silenced, but not untrue. The thought of the book haunted him, a symbol of both danger and possibility. He whispered the lines into the dark, his voice shaking but resolute. For the first time, he understood the full weight of what Aunt Lila had told him. Words were power, and power was dangerous, but it was also necessary. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of orange and gold as the slaves finished their day's work. Robert lingered near the edge of the plantation, his gaze fixed on the tree line where the world beyond seemed both terrifying and full of promise. It was there, in the fading light, that he first met the man who would change his life. "Boy, what you doing out here?" The voice was calm but firm. Robert turned to see a tall man with dark skin and sharp, intelligent eyes. He carried a bundle of goods slung over his shoulder and wore the clothes of a tradesman, though something about his demeanor suggested he was more than he seemed. "I'm just thinking," Robert replied cautiously. The man nodded, studying him for a moment before crouching down to meet Robert's eye level. "Thinking's good. Got to think to stay alive in a place like this." He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. "But you do more than think, don't you? I heard you reciting earlier." Robert stiffened. He hadn't realized anyone had been listening. "I wasn't." "Relax," the man interrupted. "I ain't here to get you in trouble. Name's Ezekiel. Used to be in a place like this, not so long ago. I got out." Robert's eyes widened. "You're free?" Ezekiel nodded. "As free as a black man can be in this world." He leaned closer. "But freedom ain't just about where you can go. It's about what's inside. What you create." Robert hesitated, then blurted out, "I make poems. In my head. I can't read or write, but I remember." Ezekiel smiled, a slow, approving grin. "That's a gift, boy. A rare one. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He reached into his bundle and pulled out a small notebook. "I can't give you much, but maybe I can give you this." Robert stared at the notebook, longing and fear warring within him. "I can't use it," he admitted. "Not yet," Ezekiel replied. "But one day, someone will write for you. Until then, keep those words alive. They matter more than you know." As Ezekiel disappeared into the dusk, Robert clutched the notebook tightly. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't dared to name before: hope. The air in the slave quarters buzzed with quiet murmurs. Word had spread about Robert's gift. At first, it was only a few who came to him: Aunt Lila, old Ben, the shy girl named Mabel. They listened as he recited his poems, his voice low but steady, weaving words that spoke of their shared pain and dreams. "Through fields of sorrow we tread each day. Yet in our hearts the stars still play." One evening, the small gatherings grew. A dozen people sat around the dim firelight, their weary faces lifted toward Robert as he spoke. His words carried them beyond the confines of the plantation, painting visions of freedom, dignity, and unity. Mabel, her voice trembling, asked, "How you come up with all that, Robert? You never even seen a book." Robert hesitated, then answered, "I don't know. It's like, the words are already inside me. I just have to find 'em." Aunt Lila nodded knowingly. "You got the Lord's gift, boy. Don't waste it." But not everyone was so encouraging. One of the older men, weary from years of toil, shook his head. "Words won't get us free. They ain't nothing but wind." Robert looked him in the eye. "Maybe not. But they can remind us who we are. And if we don't hold on to that, we lose everything." The older man said nothing, but the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken agreement. As the weeks passed, Robert's poems began to spread. The words, whispered from mouth to mouth, became a quiet rebellion, a way for the enslaved to remind each other of their humanity. But whispers carried risks. The overseer noticed the change. The way the slaves stood a little taller, their eyes held a spark that hadn't been there before. He didn't know the source yet, but he intended to find it. And Robert knew, deep down, that his words, as powerful as they were, could not remain a secret forever. The sun was high, the heat oppressive. Robert worked in silence, his movements precise but distant, his mind consumed by the lines of a new poem. Beneath the lash, our spirits rise. No chains can bind the open skies. Nearby, Samuel, the young man who had once been punished for reading, stood tall as he worked. He had memorized one of Robert's poems, and as if possessed by a force greater than himself, he began to recite it aloud. Through darkness deep, our voices sing. A truth that freedom's dawn will bring. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Heads turned, some in awe, others in fear. The overseer stormed toward Samuel, fury etched on his face. "What's this?" the overseer barked, grabbing Samuel by the collar. "Where'd you hear those words?" Samuel glanced at Robert, his gaze filled with apology and defiance. "They're mine," Samuel said, his voice trembling but firm. The overseer's eyes narrowed. "Ain't no slave smart enough to make words like that." His gaze shifted to the group. "Who's been filling your heads with nonsense?" Robert's heart pounded. He knew he couldn't let Samuel take the blame. Slowly, he stepped forward. "It's me," Robert said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I made the words." The overseer's expression twisted with anger and disbelief. "A boy like you? Think you're some kind of preacher?" Before Robert could answer, the overseer's whip lashed out, striking him across the back. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he clenched his fists, holding on to the lines in his mind. "Words are power," he whispered to himself. "And power is worth the pain." Robert lay on the dirt floor of the quarters, his back a web of raw, angry welts. Aunt Lila knelt beside him, dabbing a damp cloth to his wounds. The room was silent, the air thick with fear and admiration. "You shouldn't have done it, Robert," Aunt Lila said, her voice cracking. "I had to," Robert murmured, his voice weak but determined. "The words, they ain't just mine. They belong to all of us." That night, as the others drifted into uneasy sleep, Robert recited his poems in a whisper. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the fire in his soul. "Though beaten down, my spirit flies. The chains of earth can't touch the skies." The words spread even faster now, carried by those who had heard them firsthand. Escapees shared the poems with abolitionists, and whispers of a boy poet on a plantation reached places Robert could never imagine. The overseer tightened his grip on the slaves, but the words had already escaped. They lived in the hearts of those who had heard them, inspiring courage where fear once reigned. Years passed. The plantation was gone, its fields overgrown and its cruel overseers long forgotten. But the words of Robert, the boy who could not read or write, lived on. A young woman sat in a quiet cabin, holding a notebook in her hands. The pages were filled with poems, Robert's poems. She had learned them from her grandmother, who had been there when Robert first spoke them. Now she wrote them down, preserving them for future generations. As she finished copying the last line, she whispered it to herself. "Freedom's song, forever sung. A light for every soul among." Robert's words, born in the darkness of slavery, became a beacon of hope. They were recited at abolitionist meetings, shared in secret by those still in bondage, and celebrated by the free. Though his body had been bound, Robert's spirit had soared, proving that art could transcend the cruelest of barriers. His legacy was one of resilience, humanity, and the unyielding power of creation. And so, the poet who could not write lived on, his words a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring desire for freedom.